I discovered something that, I'm from the United States, I discovered something that Americans from the United States and Indonesians have in common, which I love, is that we all use nicknames. So we all have special names that we're called. I do the same. And thank you very much for introducing yourselves. Now I'm putting faces with names and people I've been in touch with over Skype and email over the last month. So it's just delightful to meet you, and thank you very much for the warm welcome. And I wanted to comment that there are several from Komnas HAM here today. We were absolutely delighted that so many people from the National Human Rights Commission wanted to come because Andrea and I work on a special niche of business and human rights. Not many people know about it. It tends to be a technical area, so we're absolutely delighted that so many people were actively happy to come today. So thank you very much for that. So let's start the work. What I'd like to introduce this morning is, I know that many of you know the UN Guiding Principles. I know that many of you work for many years on business and human rights issues. But what we'd like to do this morning is focus very closely on the state duty to protect and understanding the UNGPs also within a global context, a context where we've seen an important shift. So what is today about? Today is about, hopefully, in the morning, introducing some ideas and some tools that will be useful for you in your advocacy, but maybe taking it from a different angle than you're used to. And then, as Andrea said in the afternoon, you're going to play back to us how this works in the Indonesian context and what priorities we can use for our multi-stakeholder dialogue tomorrow. But I want to talk about the important shift that's taken place in the last few years in the context of investment policy. And that it's a global shift. And that global shift is about the international norms regarding what is the role of the state in ensuring the market, in particular investment, delivers public goods, which are sustainable economic growth while respecting people and the environment. And this shift is evident, for example, in the recent OECD policy framework for investment, where it states that governments, this is a quote, governments have a duty to protect the public interest and a role in providing an enabling framework for responsible business conduct. And to the extent that governments do this, they're more likely to keep and attract high-quality investors, minimize the risk of potential adverse impacts of investment, and ensure broader value creation and sustainable development. What this means is that no longer are global institutions like UNCTAD, like OECD, no longer are they talking about the fact that investment is good in and of itself. They are now talking about good investment that drives sustainable development, and they're saying that an active state that ensures that that potential negative impacts to environment and people is actually creating an enabling environment for investment. That is a very different message than you would have seen a few years ago. It's a global shift. The OECD is saying it, UNCTAD is saying it, and I would like you today to understand the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as actually part of this global shift. If you think about the UN Guiding Principles, the UN Guiding Principles came at a time when we had seen in the UN efforts to put codes of conduct on companies. Do any of you remember the UN draft norms? Were you involved in that? You knew about that, right? the model of the draft norms was a code of conduct for companies. Now, if you think about what John Ruggie did, he brought the state back into the conversation. And that was, if you think about the shift from the norms to the UNGPs, in my opinion, the most important change was bringing the state back. Because the state had disappeared from that conversation. And so as the UNGPs say the states are the primary protectors of human rights, right? They have the duty to protect, and the state is the primary actor in this story. Also, global institutions on investment are saying states need to be active in regulating investment policy. That's how you get sustainable development. So today, what our focus is the active role of the state. And we're going to talk about what does that mean then in practical terms, implementing the UN guiding principles in investment policy. So what I want to do is I want to review for you today, I'll have a new look at the UN guiding principles, thinking about the state role. So I know you know the guiding principles, but we're going to talk about the state role and focus on that so that we can think about that in investment policy, with this idea of the active role of the state and putting the state back in the driver's seat, right? So we're going to look at the UNGPs. We're going to apply the UNGPs to state investor contracts. So my work in the mandate with John Ruggie was I worked for 4 years on state investor contracts, and those are the contracts between an investor and the host state for an investment project. So that's one of the tools I'm going to give you today. They're called the Principles for Responsible Contracts. We'll talk through those. That might be interesting for your work. It might be interesting for the discussion tomorrow. We'll see. And then I'll talk about shifts and growing expectations. Okay. I'm sorry, it's really hard for me when I look up there and I see Indonesian and I don't know Indonesian. So I have to keep looking at a million things to remember where I am. I'll have to learn it. So if you remember, those of you who followed John Ruggie's mandate, the first thing he did was he diagnosed global governance gaps. And I hope some of you might remember those. And what are global governance gaps? Those are the gaps between the scope and impact of economic forces and actors and the capacity of societies to manage their adverse consequences. What John Ruggie said in 2008 was that global governance gaps create the permissive environment for adverse impacts on people without adequate sanction or reparation. So it's about the absence of governance in certain contexts. And there are several types of global governance gaps. And this is important for our discussion later, so I'm sorry I'm getting quite detailed and technical, but I think it will help us as we think about solutions. First, there are structural governance gaps. And structural governance gaps is one of the most important when we're talking about investment. What are structural governance gaps? That's the imbalance in global rulemaking, where you have rules intended to widen and deepen markets that are more robust and strongly enforced than rules intended to protect people and the environment. And Pak Kul has talked about this close relationship between governments and investors because they build this relationship up for investment projects, etc. Yes, but it doesn't mean that you have to have structural governance gaps, right? You can have that relationship structured in a proper way. Then we have what we call vertical and horizontal policy incoherence. And that means either that the human rights obligations of the state don't come down, so they might be agreed at the national level, but they're not filtered down to regional and local governments. and also that the human rights duties of the state are located in perhaps one area, one ministry, but they're not then mainstreamed across other ministries. So for example, does the investment agency know about the UNGPs? That's a question. We did a workshop last week in Colombia, 10 days ago in Colombia, with 40 government people from different agencies that have to do with investment. None of them knew the UNGPs, right? So that's policy incoherence, lack of coherence. Then we've got capacity related, where the government either fails to implement the laws on the books because they don't have the means, because they fear the consequences in a competitive global environment, or because, and Pakul has mentioned before, corruption. So private interests somehow trump the public interest. And then we have the corporate governance gap, which is that the rules and regulations of corporate governance are either silent on human rights, or they even, and they don't even talk about the broader impact of business on societies. So those are governance gaps. And I also want to insert a little caveat here. I know that a lot of NGOs around the world are very skeptical about the UNGPs, and I don't think that it's bad to be skeptical about the UNGPs. I think that the treaty discussion has been a healthy, has brought some healthy criticisms to the table. But today, what I would like to do is just, I would like to say that today is about understanding what can we take away from the UNGPs. What tools and levers can we take from the UNGPs? Not that they're going to save the world, and the UNGPs are the answer to everything, but I think that they can help, specifically in investment policy. So I would just say, if we have criticisms of the UNGPs, those are important. We can talk about them at lunch. But what today is about is just getting the fruit from the UNGPs. What can we get from them that can help, right? How can we use them in a practical sense? But I'm not trying to force you to be in love with the UNGPs, and I'm not selling the UNGPs as the thing that's going to save the world. But I do think, in particular in investment policy, the UNGPs are a wonderful tool. So you don't have to worry about offending me, even though I worked on the UNGPs. That's what I want to say. So let's think about the UNGPs. As you probably know, right, they're built on 3 pillars. And the most important thing to remember is, and I think this is the key to the UNGPs, if you know one thing from today that came from the UNGPs, it's the idea of differentiated responsibilities, right? This was key. So the idea was separating the state from the company and giving them both responsibilities. I have it. I want to skip here. This, for me, is absolutely key. The state has responsibilities. Is this the state? Yes. The company has responsibilities. They're parallel. They run in parallel. They're not dependent on each other. And so when we talk about state responsibilities, I don't think we should only talk about, because companies have a responsibility to respect, what does the state have to do? We need to be thinking in investment policy, what does the state have to do because it has to protect human rights? It's not a corollary only, right? It's not because they're related. The state has its own duties, and we'll talk about those through. So we have to think of those as separate. Okay? Okay, so I can't read it. I need to. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, so the UNGPs, we know that it's an authoritative framework, and we know it's being operationalized, and we also know that different things are taking place in the world, right? So we are seeing regulatory changes, normative changes, we're seeing companies changing practices, and we're seeing changes in expectations. And those expectations are also changes in the expectations of the state. And think of that linked with the global investment institutions that are also saying states should be changing their role. It's okay for states to be more active in regulating their economies and in regulating investment. And that actually is an enabling environment for investment, right? So when we think about what is the momentum globally now for where the state should stand on investment, right? And with respect to companies, there's a push now for a more active state, okay? Okay. So let's look at the UNGPs in a little more detail. Okay, so the foundational principles are protect against human rights abuse by third parties, right? The different things the state has to do, they have to prevent, investigate, punish, and redress. How do they do it? They do it through policies, regulation, and adjudication. So when we're thinking about recommendations for the National Action Plan, we should be thinking about these things, right? And number two, in the UNGPs, they talk about setting expectations that all business enterprises respect human rights through their operations. This is extremely important in investment because expectations also has legal meaning in investment law. Andrea will talk more about that, but UNGP number 2 talks about how the state sets expectations. We're going to talk about what agencies in Indonesia are actually setting expectations. Maybe they don't even realize they're setting expectations for investors, but they are in a legal sense. So what can the state do to set the expectations that every investor coming in and going out of Indonesia respects human rights? It's one of the things we'll work on this afternoon. And then the UNGPs has operational principles, which I can't read here. Yeah. No, that's true. It's terrible. I've never done it before with the Indonesian. Yeah. Okay. So it talks about the state business nexus, state-controlled enterprises, and what else? Here. Yeah, no, this is 3. Okay, so it talks about the general regulatory. At 3, we talk about the general regulatory and policy functions of the state. It talks about the state business nexus, where you've got companies or investors benefiting from state agencies, for example, export credits. Then it talks about conflict. And is this conflict? This is conflict? This is conflict. It talks about conflict because conflict is a very particular context. And that is important for Colombia, our work in Colombia, but it might be important here, so we can talk about that later. And then? Oh yeah, that's the most important, okay. And then it talks about policy coherence. Coherence, okay. Policy coherence. Policy coherence is one of the other key issues for investment policy. Why? Looking at investment brings to the fore different agencies and actors that maybe you don't get to from a general business and human rights approach. So thinking about investment starts you thinking about, well, what does the investment promotion agency have to do with all this? And what does the investment agency, you have a unified agency here, but what does it mean for the Ministry of Agriculture? What does it mean for the Ministry of Forestry? What does it mean for the negotiators on investment contracts and investment treaties at the international level? So today we're also going to talk about policy coherence quite carefully. So let's think about a minute, and this is about what the state has to do in its regulatory functions. And this is something that, these will help us also formulate recommendations and ideas. The first is, in order to meet their duty to protect, they have to enforce the laws that they have, but also review whether they have appropriate laws on the books, right? Periodically review. And then they have to ensure that their corporate law structure supports responsibility, respect, and the protection of human rights. Provide effective guidance to business enterprises on how to respect human rights, and then encourage the communication of how businesses are dealing with human rights. So those are the policy functions that the UNGPs lay out. And then we've got, when we talk about state nexus, we talk about two different, we talk about state-controlled enterprises, and state-controlled enterprises in the UNGPs, they're pointed out why. Because state-controlled enterprises, depending on the act of that state-controlled enterprise, and I don't know in Indonesia if you have important state-controlled enterprises involved in major projects, but state-controlled enterprises can also, in law, bind the state sometimes, right? So you could be talking about state responsibility for what that state enterprise does, right? So there's a nexus there between that commercial entity and the state entity, and you can start to talk about some legal risk there. And then there is this nexus between the state and companies where you've got state support for company behavior. So if you've got, for example, we said export credit agencies, then you've got a stronger policy argument that the state should be doing something to ensure due diligence, doing something to ensure the companies are behaving properly, and also ensuring that the state agency itself is doing its own due diligence, right? So that's another area where we have this nexus. It's another area in investment policy when we talk later today about ideas and recommendations where we have a strong argument there for the state to be doing something. And this is conflict, but I think we can go forward on that. And then policy coherence. And in policy coherence here, when we think about this, I think one of the dynamics we would like to explore with you today is policy coherence between the national level and then what happens at the regional and local level, especially in the context of investment projects. What gets carried through from the commitments at the national level? How is that carried through at the local level? What is there policy coherence there? Is there a lack of communication information from the national to the local level? How are investments structured in terms of who's getting the benefits locally, nationally, and what are the dynamics from the local officials to follow through on the commitments from the national level? And what are the gaps there? Are there capacity gaps? Are there other problems of corruption that we see at the local level that we need to focus on? And then maintaining policy space. This is UNGP number 9 was basically my work for the 4 years. And what did my work look at? That work looked at whether in investment agreements, so these technical agreements, whether they're contracts or whether they're international level, it looked at whether the state was promising away its own regulatory capacity, basically. And that's a little overstated, but to give you the idea, what that work looked at was whether the contracts or the investment treaties could be used by investors to actually stop the state from regulating an individual project or an investor in areas connected to human rights. Okay? And this is key for our discussion on investment. Andrea will also cover it. We have to make sure that the way states are formulating investment policy, and it could happen in policy, it could happen in law, it could happen in contracts, it could happen in treaties, the way that those are formulated, they do not threaten the policy space that the state needs in order to fulfill its duty to protect. So we said in the beginning, to duty to protect, you have to investigate, punish, regulate, adjudicate, all of those things, right? But you also have to make sure that you're not cutting short your own policy space in investment contracts, treaties, investment law, and investment policy. Okay? And we'll talk more about that. It's after. Just to review, thinking about what most of you, I think, work on the private sector side, so you're very familiar with this, right? So states have to ensure that they respect human rights and address the negative impacts when they happen. The important things about RTR that came from the UNGPs, and these discussions happened, and the UNGPs innovated on this, is that all businesses, right, worldwide, all businesses, and that's a discussion that's coming up now in the treaty debate in Geneva, but all businesses in all contexts, they're independent responsibilities, independent of state human rights obligations. That's also absolutely key, and for those of you who have followed business and human rights for many years, you may know how strange that was, because it was very different, even from guidelines like the OECD guidelines. They were always dependent. The company always had responsibilities with respect to what the state had agreed. Now we have completely independent, right? The responsibility of respect is completely independent from the state human rights obligations. And then these are additional responsibilities beyond domestic rules and laws on human rights. And as you know, human rights due diligence, right? It's a management system. I identify potential and actual adverse impacts, integrate and act upon the findings, track the effectiveness, and communicate how impacts are addressed. And I'm just giving you that. I know you know it, but just to review so we have it fresh in our minds. And then remedy. And these two are state-based, right? But the state has 3 duties here. And I think it's important to review those. First, they have to offer access to judicial remedy. They have to round that out with offering non-judicial opportunities for remedy, but they also have to encourage and support, right, the non-state mechanisms. So when we think about the state and remedy, I think we should think in these 3 boxes. Right? What should they be doing in terms of judicial? What should they be doing in terms of non-judicial? And what should they be doing to actively support and ensure that you've got non-state, non-judicial mechanisms? Okay. Before I go on to talk about the principles for responsible contracts, which is our first tool that we're going to acquire today, does anyone have any questions about what we talked about here?